Good ka.
Okay, Sonny Africa, thank you for joining us again. This is it. All right, I think nag-warm up tayo after some technical difficulty. Let's talk about this. Now, in the Philippines, political discourse, social discourse, media discourse, whatever, even academic discourse sometimes, always two groups are blamed for everything that went wrong in the Philippines, more than usual, right? Trapos, political dynasties, and oligarchs, big conglomerates controlling the commanding heights of the economy. Okay, to a certain degree, I agree with that, right? Indeed, that we have but one of the things I noticed is that people don't talk about the role of technocrats in overseeing the Philippine economic management. Because if you have competent technocrats who know what to do, what's best for the country at a certain period in time, in terms of the ladder of economic development, then you're going to have Korea. Then you're going to have Taiwan. I mean, that's why I never believe in that comparative advantage, whatever, traditional economics, because Korea had zero shipbuilding industry when they started in the 50s. They had to send people all over to Scotland. Let's go even further back. Japan had no real manufacturing to talk about. It was a feudal country in the 19th century. It took them 20 years of civil war and all to become a new modernizing country. So they all created their comparative advantage from scratch. And in fact, in the previous episode, we discussed how on China, I slightly disagree because later on China became much more FDI dependent, but thanks to corporate espionage and all, medyo nabawin. But definitely South Korea and Japan, we have a lot of example, a lot of data that shows they were able to industrialize with very little FDI because they forced technology transfer. Okay, I think I like how you made me less politically correct on this. So they build their own brands. That's why they can talk about Toyota, Hyundai, all of these big brands that you know. Here in Southeast Asia, we have had a lot of growth and development, but it's not inclusive development. We don't have our own brands. Like, tell me a single Southeast Asian industry that is globally competitive in the high-end industries. I can only think about Vietnam's VinFast kind of getting there, but even that, we can have a long discussion about how performative it is. So all I'm saying here, Sonny Africa, is it looks like we do not really hold our technocrats to the same scrutiny level as our trapos and oligarchs, who clearly have come very short in terms of management of the country. Because in my opinion, the technocrats may not be as powerful as political dynasties or oligarchs. They don't have as much money, perhaps. They don't have although some of them may come from privileged background, but they did have a role in preventing the Philippines, perhaps, or not pushing the Philippines in the right direction in terms of adopting the right policies, which we'll discuss more in the next episode, trade and in industrial policy. So I want to go back to this because you work in NEDA shortly. You have had interaction with the Filipino technocrats, very smart people. With my good friend Lisandro Claudio the other day, we were discussing how actually people like Jokno, for instance, once they were out of government, they would say things that you and I are about to say, but once they're inside the government, suddenly something else is happening. So there's something with the bureaucracy. And in fact, the argument is there's perhaps even pressure on these technocrats not to do the right thing because the elite class, the property class, has an interest in a conservative, inflation-busting economic strategy, not on a productivity, manufacturing-driven strategy that may hurt their interest, right? Because kung mayaman ka, inflation is your number one problem. Inflation cuts into your savings, into your assets, etc. And you're not so interested about manufacturing and job creation and all. So having said that, I'm just framing where I'm coming from, Sonny. What is your take on this? To what degree are the Filipino technocrats and our, grand economists who talk about corruption? I mean, corruption is a problem, but the corruption was a problem in China, Malaysia, Singapore. In Taiwan, all of
Korea, Taiwan.
And they still grow. So you cannot blame corruption. There are levels of corruption, and there's also efficient corruption in the literature, right? You may have corruption, but high growth still. High corruption, not much of high quality growth. What's the role of technocrats here, Sonny?
Okay. Technocrats, the pinaka-manifestation of their work, of course, are all these development plans we've had. Since about 1947, after independence, we had the Baser Plan, the Hibben Plan, made by American technocrats. And then since then, series of so many plans transitioning to Filipino plans, Quaderno, Ulobel, all the way to the current Philippine development plans. So the role of technocrats in the abstract, they should be the ones framing how the economy runs. But what has been the problem in the Philippines? Technocrats, were the first American technocrats doing our first development plans. Unfortunately, even to the present, even through the supposedly nationalist Marxist administration, the first Marcos administration, a coherent vision of economic nationalism. They also actually never had a coherent vision of Philippine national industrialization. So the potential role of the technocrat never manifested into development for the Philippines because they never actually framed economic policy in the right sort of way. So parang sa akin, the problem actually even got worse. I mean, you kind of assume, diba, as time progresses, people learn, people become more reflective, they learn from the mistakes. Actually, the irony is, in the last 40 years, despite a long negative experience with failed development plans since 1946-47, actually things took a turn for the worse. For some reason, economic management was viewed as parang taking away protectionist policies, taking away state intervention in the economy, taking away how corrupt, inefficient public officials intervene in the economy. Now, that was a problem kasi if they even had a semblance of looking at the economic history of any development country in the world, as in whether talking about US, Western Europe, or looking at the kind of more recent advances under socialist countries,
newly industrialized countries, late developing countries, that whole
or even South Korea, Taiwan. But sorry, to put it bluntly, economic policy shifted from what should the state do to just what should the state not do. And that has, I think, had been the most damaging 40 years in Philippine economic history, where we are actually right now continuing history. Instead of building up the capacity of the state to build domestic industry, to build our social services, agriculture, the rest of the economy, instead of building the foundation, it's all been about, no, let's take away anything that gets in the way of the market, then let the market decide what economic structure we have. In that sense, they've been successful. Their textbooks told them, unleash the market. What comes out sa kanila, there was a conclusion. That's the kind of economy we should have because of the market says. That's where we are right now. That's why manufacturing has fallen. That's why agriculture stayed backward. That's why we're a bloated, informal service economy. Kasi instead of building the economy, they took out all the mechanisms for the state to intervene. And I think that is such a key point kasi parang analogy. Ang nangyari, economic policy making parang sculpture. You take away all the mga interventions, it reveals that perfect market economy. Hindi ganun eh. The analogy should be, we have to build a house or a building. And to build that, you have to have the tools. But we took away the tools eh. And I think, unless ma-appreciate talaga na it's not about making things simpler. Yun na palang sinasabi nila. Oh, all these tariff controls are so complicated. Let's simplify them. Oh, all these tax measures are so complicated. Let's simplify them. Oh, these investment regulations are so complicated. For investors complaining, let's simplify them. Actually, by simplifying them, we've advocated our responsibility to build the economy. We've taken away the tools to build economic development. And that's where we are right now. So I totally agree. Why aren't our technocrats held accountable? Because they're being measured by those metrics of free market success of textbooks, of taking away supposed state intervention measures. But even intervention, actually mali yun eh. The state always...
Yeah, I mean, in short, Sonny, what you're saying is that our technocratic class
shapes the economy. So it's not like parang economy.
Right.
In short, they've debilitated the capacity of the state to build the economy in the right direction. And they have this whole ideological superstructure justifying the removing those measures we should have. Kung may value judgment na. If it's something that intervenes with the hypothetical market forces, mali na raw yun. But that's wrong eh. And again, look, whether you talk about UK in the 18th century, France in the 19th century, like you said, even Japan, late 19th, early 20th century, even right now, South Korea, Taiwan, 50s, 60s, 70s, and they're the last great industrializers. I think one key point, there has not been a breakout industrialized country in the last 40 years of so-called neoliberal globalization because the market does not deliver development. The market on its own doesn't deliver industrialization. If you don't have those two things, you won't have development. And it's so frustrating kasi there's a whole ideological superstructure that's been shaken na in the last 10 years. But yung technocrats
including
natin,
in the US, but not in the Philippines. Yeah, which I think we can discuss more when we talk about industrial policy. I mean,
Yeah.
Sonny, if I put it, I mean, I remember the joke we used to have in UP, like, nakiki-postmodern, hindi pa nga tayo modern. Ito yung, ito yung hindi pa nga tayo nag-build ng strong state institutions against regulation and developmental state strategy na agad, diba? I mean, you will never know how effective can regulation be when you never really try to build the right institutions for proper regulations. So what you're saying is that we have had a very conservative, risk-averse, policy of omission ideology essentially dominating our technocratic class, no? And I think there's also the politics, right? I mean, it's like, alam ng mga technocrats na yan, if they hurt a lot of big businesses and big bankers and all. I mean, because remember, we also have the revolving door phenomenon. I'm not, again, there are always exceptions to the rule, but some people are technocrats one day and then they get out of government, they're in the board of governors, some big bank, and life is good, right? So in a lot of times, a lot of our technocrats did not take the risk that they should have taken because they were coyed to become diffident. Just follow the policy of omission, conservative, risk-averse kinds of approach. And they fell for this whole ideology of the state is bad, the market is good, which is complete nonsense, because not only do we have example of the state becoming very effective in pushing for industrialization. I mean, this internet would not have happened if not for the role of Pentagon. In fact, we can give a lot of examples of that. But the market in the Philippines was never a free market. What market are they talking about? It's essentially like 4 or 5 big players, right? So if you leave it to the market, you're essentially leaving it to the 4 or 5 big conglomerates to dominate all the commanding heights of the economy. So they're enablers of an oligarchic economic structure in that sense, right? Whether they want it or not. I mean, those Chicago school theories were made in the United States with far more vibrant, competitive free market dynamics. But even the US got into trouble. The financial crisis 2008. So Philippines was never there. It was always a semi-feudalistic, semi-modern, barely industrializing country. So talk about market forces just doesn't make sense. What market forces? Only a few big conglomerates almost control everything, right? Yeah.
I think our technocrats are good students of economics, which is, I think, in a lot of ways a bad thing. Because the economics being taught in the schools is precisely this wrong economics. It is wrong. The market has never, ever delivered development anywhere in the world, in the whole span of economic history. On the contrary, the most successful developers or industrializers, even setting aside for the moment, the questions of imperialist plunder, using cheap labor resources, markets for other countries. There's that aspect, but the state has always had to have a strong hand running the economy. But unfortunately, that's why it's so strange right now. Naging merit good pa to have a small state. Kasi sinisiraan because it's corrupt daw, it's inefficient. But the thing is, unless you do it and you improve our institutions, make it less corrupt, make them more efficient, you have to just do it. You have to invest in that to build that capacity. And that capacity has actually been eroded. And I think that's one of my ugly things talaga.
Yeah.
Even at the height of yung supposedly strong state natin, the Marcos dictatorship, because of this ideology na let's shrink the state, and they seized onto the corruption of the Marcos the Marcos dictatorship, diba? They seized on that as we're gonna lay waste to all the mga mechanisms of economic intervention because that was used by the Marcos government to enrich their cronies. Actually, it was throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Kasi yes, fix the corruption.
Agree.
But you don't fix the corruption by taking away the tools. Use the tools, build the tools.
Right.
And actually, yung lost decade natin, it's not actually primarily because of the debt burden. The lost decade was for 2 reasons. One, the super domestic manufacturing, it squeezed local agriculture, it cut in fiscal capacity and state to intervene in the economy. That wasn't it. Ang problema, kahit nakalagpas tayo dun sa lost decade by like the mid-2000s, we now have a state that has no capacity to actually intervene properly. Even worse, we don't actually have any technocrats or technocratic class or even academic institutions teaching that the government has to intervene in the economy. So we're still using our like 1967.
Right. We're still in that phase. I mean, my understanding, Sonny, is
economics textbooks, and
right.
yun nga, About yung central banking.
Yeah. And so my sense is, Sonny, you're saying they're good students of economics, good students, but not necessarily good leaders, right? They're following this kind of ideologically tinged market first, state second kind of ideology. But in terms of really pushing for the Philippine national interest and industrialization, nakakulang sila. The last thing I want to talk about under this episode is, a lot of our technocrats tend to become heroes because they're against corruption. They're for good governance. They're for accountability. So our idea of a good technocrat is yung malinis, hindi kurakot or lumalaban sa corruption. So recently we had I think Undersecretary of Finance who resigned because of the Maharlika Fund issue, and now she's like a hero of liberals and all of that. But we know being a good technocrat is way more than just going against corruption and for accountability, right? This is about pushing for the right policies that brings about inclusive growth and development. Do you think we have over obsession with corruption? I mean, corruption is obviously bad, but perhaps we're missing the bigger picture here. We're just focusing on corruption or debt, right? Yeah.
I know my favorite example for that is South Korea. In South Korea, okay, politically incorrect. They actually institutionalized corruption. So nangyari doon, basically corruption became a tax. So basically, anyone doing a public works project or benefiting from public subsidy, automatically, all the mga bidders for that, all the ones sort of trying to fit into that contract, knew they had to put in whatever, 5%, 10%, 15% na tax na may bribe sila doon. But it was institutionalized in a sense na 15%. So the corrupt technocrat would actually be choosing among a lot of bidders, all paying the same tax. So ang incentive niya, look for the most effective bidder. Kasi the more effective that bidder, mas malaki yung kita, yung percentage niya mas malaki.
Right, right.
Sa Pilipinas, hindi
Take away the
tax yung
temptation.
corruption.
Yeah.
I've heard that.
Yes, I see your point there.
Yung tax,
Sonny, pwede natin ulitin yung part about
pipili among different bidder.
Yeah, sorry, Sonny. Can you repeat the part about?
Sorry.
Yeah, can we repeat the part about corruption in the Philippines? Compared to corruption in South Korea.
Okay.
Yeah, just a distinction about the situation in South Korea as opposed to the Philippines. So what we're saying is that a lot of countries, a lot of our neighbors had a lot of corruption, and yet they were still able to have a lot of growth. But it's about how you approach corruption, or the whole efficient corruption kind of. So sa atin masyadong moralizing. There's no institutional framework. So again, can we just make a distinction? Sorry, I lost you slightly. What distinction between the Korean version, which by the way, she's not unique. We also had that in Japan. We also had that Taiwan. We had that in Germany. A lot of late developing countries. This is a story of all late developing, newly industrialized countries. So what is this problem in the Philippines? Masyado ba natin moralizing corruption issue? As bad as it is, it doesn't explain really everything. It barely even scratches the surface, right? So what's the problem with corruption in the Philippines compared to corruption in South Korea or other countries? I mean, just for people to know, remember, a lot of problems in Korea until now is because of corruption scandals involving the big conglomerates or chaebols. So hanggang today, they're still, one of their presidents, their own version of Junior, si Park Geun-hye, right? Daughter of former dictator General Park. She lost power. She was impeached and she was imprisoned temporarily because of corruption scandals with the heir of the Samsung family. So to say that Korea is so developed because they don't have corruption, are you kidding me? They have huge scandals in corruption. How many of their presidents went to jail because of corruption? Myung-bak, another president, had to deal with it. So I think we're barely scratching the surface. But in the Philippines, there's this obsession about corruption ay ang ugat ng lahat ng mga problema. When in fact, corruption itself is a manifestation of even a deeper problem, which we'll discuss later on. Sorry, I just was doing a recap because we had a slight disconnection problem. Can we say that again, the distinction between Korean corruption versus Philippine corruption? Why is ours so bad, so inefficient, aside from being so morally evil?
Okay. Oddly, because corruption was a tax in Korea, despite the corruption in Korea is still allowed the best, most effective, most efficient private sector bidders and contractors to operate. Because the corrupt government official actually gets a bigger cut the more effective the private sector participant he or she chooses. In the Philippines, hindi siya tax paid the same by all the bidders. In the Philippines, yung corruption, commodity, presyuhan siya. So nangyayari, yung pinakamahusay, pinakamalaking binabayad na bribe, not necessarily pinakamahusay, yun na napipili. And I think that's not to say let's promote corruption, kundi iba yung
We're
naging...
against corruption, but again, we were saying there are levels and there are types of corruption, and ours is the worst.
At saka, I think important point din eh. In Korea, the best producer won despite corruption. In the Philippines, the worst producers can get the bid because they pay the biggest bribe. At magkakaiba yun eh. Tapos, sa separate point, sinabi mo, we're over-exaggerating talaga yung impact ng corruption on development eh. I mean, there are no studies that have that correlation na the more corrupt, the less developed. So sa amin, naging diversionary pa siya kasi corruption is now blamed on the use of government instruments by corrupt bureaucrats and technocrats to favor certain parties. Ang problema, by taking away those instruments, supposedly take away corruption, yun nga, you've actually emaciated the capacity of the state to intervene sa economy, which is so necessary. So yung nga throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So it's not an endorsement of corruption, but yun nga, tama ka eh. Itumbok mo, ano yung problema? The problem is not the instrument. And with that sort of market thinking, blame the state, Marcos dictatorship is a big, I think, psychological barrier talaga eh, na because wielded all these instruments for self-interest.
That's a good point.
Tinapon nila. And I think right now, unfortunately, kahit sa walang corrupt po ng mahirap, hindi nasasapul eh. We're not poor because we're corrupt. We're actually poor because we don't have the right policies. And corruption, sa gilid lang yan. It's not a core.
And corruption is also a reflection of poverty. I mean, if you look at the studies around the world, shows that levels of corruption tend to be way higher when countries are poorer because there are no institutions to regulate it. So in a sense, we're also corrupt because we're poor, right? I mean, it's like you know what I'm saying? That's why in the most corrupt regions of the Philippines, there are a lot of political dynasties, so-called fat or obese dynasties, very politically incorrect to put it, but also high levels of corruption. High levels of corruption also feeds poverty. So there's this kind of a vicious cycle there. And so I think this perfectly sets the tone for our last episode for today, which is industrial policy, because industrial policy is all about the state. You need to have a strong state that can, you know, sometimes even bludgeon, right, certain market players to do the right thing for the country, for national development, not only for their own pockets or political dynasties or family or whatever. So thank you so much on that. I really appreciate it, Sonny. This is the kind of conversation I think we have to have about the Philippines. Inflation is important. Corruption is bad. But it's way more than that. And that's what exactly we're trying to do. Maraming salamat, Sonny Africa, Executive Director of IBON Foundation, for joining us today.